Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you. I'm always glad to be here.
You're welcome. Welcome, Irina. Several big topics again, and this time, the Iran war, the Strait of Hormuz. What's the latest there? And the 15-point plan, one more plan from the Trump administration. How does it all look like? Do we see the end of it all, or do we see that the regime winning in whatever way by survival itself?
Well, there's a few things going on, and all of them at the same time, and it makes it a little bit hard to figure out what's going on. On the one hand, Trump claims that the negotiations are going very well. Iran denies that there's any talks at all, but at the same time, Iran sent Kushner and Witkoff home, claiming that they essentially misled Iran and they failed to prevent attacks. And therefore, it would prefer to deal with J.D. Vance and Rubio, who can be held politically accountable because they have official positions in the U.S. government. Iran also rejected the 15-point plan and made its own counter demands, which are patently absurd. That, however, doesn't mean that there's nothing going on. In fact, Iran is very likely deliberately covering its tracks and using face-saving measures to make it seem like it's not actually engaged in real haggling with the United States, but behind the scenes, very likely there's some sort of communication which is likely to continue even as military operations and combat are ongoing. US is preparing additional leverage depending on how things go. And it's not uncommon to pursue several tracks simultaneously. US is preparing 2,000 to 3,000 paratroopers for a potential ground operation. Now, many are speculating that this operation could be involving Horg Island, which contains a good amount of oil and which was rumored, which Trump already struck through airstrikes. Some have criticized that move, claiming that occupying the island physically is not the same as conducting airstrikes, that this is potentially a death trap for American soldiers, but we don't know for sure whether that's where the troops would be heading anyway. There could be any number of operations they may be involved in, and they could also just be for deterrence measure to strengthen Trump's leverage in any negotiations. Trump has also considered pausing the fighting for a 1 month ceasefire. It's not clear whether the ceasefire is a deception measure to lull Iran into a false sense of complacency, whether it's a tactical pause to regroup, whether it's a pause for negotiations to allow talks to take a chance. We do know that several of the officials, including the foreign minister, were taken off the potential hit list in order to strengthen the likelihood of negotiations going through. Trump has also sent mysterious and mixed signals, at one point claiming that Iran supposedly agreed to freeze its nuclear program, at other points claiming that Iran has prepared a huge present regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Perhaps it means that Iran would withdraw from its enforced enforced quota, financial quota it enacts against passing ships in order not to attack them. None of that is very clear, and it is possible that either Iran itself is sending very mixed messages, Trump doesn't really understand what's going on and is saying whatever works with the public, or this is a deliberately deceiving maneuver in order not to reveal cards to the public and yet to communicate something to different audiences. We also know that Trump told his own team that he wants the operations to wrap up soon, because he wants the war to end. The Israeli sources claim that Trump wants all of the kinetic attacks to end by April 9th. Other sources say that more time may be needed. None of that resolves the question whether Israel will proceed with its own operations, regardless of whether U.S. withdraws, freezes the military operations temporarily, or engages in diplomacy. For now, Israel is not stopping airstrikes, and likewise, Iran is continuing to attack both American and Israeli targets. In other words, we're either very soon going to see the conclusion of hostilities, or the war will keep on grinding on. There is absolutely no clarity about what's happening based on the available and very contradictory and conflicting information.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, what feeling do you get? All this is happening, talks, no talks happening. Is this moving towards something good, or is this moving towards something not so good? Because even in earlier wars, small number of troops used to come, and then more troops and more troops and more troops, until it was the situation got out of hand and it became a long drawn thing. What is your sense? What happens to the Strait of Hormuz? Because the world is reeling due to that, no movement of shipments.
Well, Iran claims that once US withdraws, they will stop doing what they're doing, but there's no guarantee that that's going to happen, because Iran is also looking to recoup its financial losses. On the other hand, US can't afford to rely on Iran's whims for the security of energy security, shipments, and freedom of navigation. So US needs a long-term solution, and now that Iran has gotten the taste of holding the entire international community hostage and essentially extorting financial contributions like a pirate power, there is no guarantee that any of it will end, even if peace or some sort of a negotiated settlement to the war occurs. That's a risk that will be hanging over the international community, and that US can simply can't allow. Nevertheless, we also saw that the regime is entrenched and resilient, despite the deaths of high-ranking commanders and officials and spiritual leaders. It continues to engage in hostilities, and quite brazenly ignoring US overtures and opportunities to settle this issue, at least temporarily. This means that Iran feels fairly confident that US at some point is going to have to withdraw, either because weapons runs out, because the domestic political pressure becomes too big, because the energy problem raises the costs to a way that's unaffordable and unjustifiable, or because it will see that further action is not yielding any serious and improved results. That's Iran's calculus, that it can outweigh Trump, no matter what is the current decision by the Trump administration. If Trump does engage in tactical, limited ground operations, those operations would have to be very targeted and very quick. But I am sure that uh, that there is a risk of escalation, a risk that US will need to send further troops to protect these troops, because much will depend on the context in which they're used, whether they're there just for deterrence, whether they're there to actually partake in operations or as auxiliary units, whether they'll be targeted by Iran or not, and whether this will ultimately turn into a quagmire. And this is the fear that is growing among many people, that none of this will be enough to weaken and destabilize the regime sufficiently that it will be forced to turn entirely inwards. It will not. None of these attacks will lead to the promised mass defections among the RGC and others. So it's not very clear where it's all going. It is, however, wise for the administration to keep the element of surprise and not to reveal its intentions about the troops, especially if that decision hasn't been made exactly. If they're there as a reserve for future reference, that's it's good to keep that card, those cards close to the West.
Absolutely, Irina. So we don't know what's happening in the coming days, but till now, do you think, it's a loss of pace for President Trump because the regime has survived? He made promises to the people, we are coming, I will be coming, and all that thing about democracy and restoring all that. How does it look like? Because and what will be the win for him at all if he has to move away from this particular situation, which is still unfolding? But what does it look like here?
I do think that no matter how things go and what happens, Trump will eventually put an end to operations, because he does not want an extended war, and he's made that very clear. And he will try to make it seem like no matter what happens, he was coming at it from a position of strength. So no matter how things go, whether we'll see additional fighting, whether there'll be a negotiated agreement, whether he will call a ceasefire, whether he will simply leave, he will claim that US fulfilled its military agenda, its goals, and that this was a victory, and it was a decisive victory. And there is already a choir of assorted people claiming that we are already winning the war, that everything is going well, and that the critics are ignoring the successes. I don't think it's true. I think the tactical successes have been duly noted. I think no one is arguing that Iran's regime has not been set back significantly, at least in a conventional military sense, and that there has been some level of chaos and weakening. But it is also true that while the fighting is ongoing, the Iranian people don't have an opportunity to leave and protest on return to their normal lives. There's no one is going to protest under gunfire. It's also likely true that if the regime remains in power, and no matter what is negotiated regarding the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, the terrorist organization, there will be no relief for the Iranian people. US is not going to come back just to save them after all of this is said, it is done, and the Iranian regime may continue to attack them both physically and by depriving them of an opportunity to communicate effectively.
Absolutely, absolutely. What about Pakistan here? What about Israel here? Pakistan seems to have got some spotlight, some limelight here due to the negotiations and their whatever role that they are playing or not playing.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Yes, yes. What about the roles of Israel and Pakistan here? Will Israel be still fighting this war for a long time? And also about Pakistan's role here, is it playing some role in mediation, helping the President of United States bringing peace to that region? What is your sense? How did they come into being? Why did the president involve them into this?
Regarding Israel, Israeli sources are claiming that Israel is prepared for weeks of war. Nevertheless, it has also not argued against US efforts to negotiate. So all of that indicates that either Israel will have to follow US or it may remain on its own to conclude some tactical goals without US involvement, but at the very least, it is foreseeing the possible involvement for a fairly significant period of time. Of course, US may not withdraw as quickly as some people believe. It's really when you're sending thousands of troops to the region, all of that costs money, all of that costs preparation. This means that there is a good chance they'll be used at least in some capacity, not just by standing around. So I don't think we should expect the fighting to end in the next few days unless there is a very quick surprise in the works behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So, what happens to the 15, point plan? Means it just plan on paper. None of the plan seems to be working for President Trump, either in terms of Ukraine, Russia, or any other place.
No, no. On the contrary, this plan, I do think that um, there is some sort of a discussion taking place in the background, but it's unclear what the level is at this point. It's also Pakistan has publicly approached the US and offered mediation services, but it could be a misleading maneuver. The negotiations could already be ongoing in Pakistan, and the public statement was there to essentially coordinate the public and the private for the benefit of the American audiences and others who are trying to make sense of what's happening. So likely Pakistan is playing some role. I'm not sure that the role is as much, making real peace as saving the regime and simply putting an end to immediate damage. Peace in the region is unlikely to resume until fully and in a real sense until the regime is completely defanged and is unable to continue terrorizing and attacking other countries, until that its entire ideology is changes and until it's deprived of any means to leverage whatever power it has against others. It will remain a threat, and there will be no real peace. I mean, we are already seeing political breakdown in relations between Iran and the Gulf states, and also additional consequences even in some of the European countries. Still, all of these 15, 20 points plans, they count on the other party being equally committed to the negotiation process. But that is not the case. Iran is looking to outweigh the Trump administration with the hope that the Democrats coming to Congress in midterms will constrain his ability to continue funding the war effort. And as far as the Gaza process is concerned, it's very obvious that Hamas is consolidating power, and despite the official presentation of the Hamas disarmament plan to the United Nations by the Gaza Peace Board, there is still no practical pathway to making that happen. As I've mentioned previously, the thousands of international peacekeepers who may be joining Gaza on the ground whenever the Iran issue settles down or at an allotted time period are ill-equipped to handle disarmament. At best, they could be trying to keep peace, but physically disarming Hamas, it's not clear that they're prepared to do that. And with Ukraine, the situation is even worse for Trump, because now there are leaks from the Ukrainian government that Trump is literally threatening to withdraw aid and intelligence assistance unless Ukraine gives up the territory that Russia is unable to take militarily, and which, by the way, Ukraine has been slowly liberating. All of that points to questions about Trump's motivation in this conflict, whether he's looking to really engage in peacemaking, and or whether his concern is making sure that Russia gets to have something after it's the 4 years of intense full-scale invasion.
Absolutely. So, whatever the situation may be, in a month or so, peace comes in, Strait of Hormuz gets opened, there will be less for Mr. Trump to take with him. Do you think now we will get to hear more about Cuba and Colombia? And because something has to be told during the midterms.
Indeed, he has already set his sights on Cuba. Some of the things we're hearing is a potential deal with the government. Another possibility is the expulsion of the president and the appointment of whoever else from the current regime. There are certainly background talks that are going on, and we don't know that after the recent grid breakdowns and blackouts in Cuba, U.S. is supplying the private sector in Cuba with fuel and supplies. Colombia too is being talked about. The potential to the president Petro, who was recently sanctioned, but then sort of returned to communicating with the administration, is reportedly under the investigation. If he's charged, or if he's labeled as some sort of a terrorist, it could be that U.S. could be, maybe trying to strike the same sort of a limited regime change, essentially a decapitation strategy in Colombia as well. Clearly, Petro is no friend of the administration, but whether this sort of interference will eventually lead to massive and populist backlash in some of those countries, or even in other countries, Cuba probably would like to see some sort of a change, even if it's a limited one. But it might be that other groups across Latin America could react differently, and there could be a rise in anti-American populist rhetoric and activity that other actors could eventually utilize. Russia, China, and Iran have largely stayed out of U.S. attempts to enforce its sphere of influence, but that has been that may change. I wouldn't, especially if Russia, for instance, finds itself losing ground in Ukraine, it may be looking for other spaces to try to preserve whatever influence it has. China is unlikely to give up its bases in Cuba and elsewhere easily. So we may see a different strategy in the near future. Much is to be seen on whether Trump's power remains intact after, however, the war in Iran ends, and what happens to all of these actors as a result.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And let's now look at the impact of this war, how it has exposed several things, how the world will now prepare for themselves, and in the and about the NATO split also. First, let's look at the Russia-Ukraine talks. Because of this, looks like the talks itself are on hold. So when do you think, and where do you think they will be going, or we should forget all the efforts that were made in the last few months?
Well, for now, they are definitely on hold, but Ukraine has actually been pushing for a return to the table. First, probably as a show of good faith, and second, because it does not want to lose the visibility as a result of the distraction by the hostilities in Iran. So far, however, there's no sign that effort is going anywhere. On the contrary, a group of Russian deputies have traveled to the US as part of a meeting with a pro-Russian Republican member of Congress, Luna, who has previously engaged in meetings with Russian diplomats here in the US. So it does seem like Trump's actions are empowering Russia quite directly. We have seen that in the last week, sanctions were lifted from Russian oil returning billions of dollars almost immediately to the country that has seen very substantial financial setbacks and setbacks to its funding for its war efforts. We have seen the quiet lifting of individual sanctions from Russian officials, which will allow them to travel and do business in the United States. And we have also seen the lifting of sanctions on Iranian oil, which are obviously helping Iran self fund, despite the fact that otherwise its financial operations were close to zero. So US is actually providing Iran with a valuable lifeline, all in the name of avoiding an energy crisis of its own making. Quite frankly, there should have been an extensive preparation for this possibility. None of that could not have been prearranged previously, and US at the very least could have benefited from all of that if it had planned out in advance.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's look at the NATO split. This particular war, whatever was happening with the US and Europe, a lot of things were talks. But this particular war is brought out in the open. NATO members did not come out so openly in the picture. They had their own reasons for it. Even the UK had constraints about the use of their joint base. And I want to understand then, how do you see this whole thing coming up in terms of NATO split? And this is something which is going to, be much more open in the coming days. And they will not move away from US from that sense of, what NATO was bringing for all those years.
Well, first of all, several countries outright refused to join the US in any capacity whatsoever, France being the most prominent example. Others have allowed limited forms of cooperation. For instance, UK has allowed the US to use its bases and has also been trying to protect its own interests in the Middle East and to coordinate in various ways without sending troops and without participating in strikes. Eventually, 22 countries, including some of the NATO members, have agreed to join the coalition to protect the ships in the Strait of Hormuz, but ultimately, so far, that coalition has not taken off the ground. European states have not agreed to provide the US with minesweepers, so we are seeing a dispute. Some people are claiming that this is a self-defeating step, that no matter how annoying Trump is and how unjustified his demands are in light of the tariff disputes and his threats to Greenland, these countries benefit from having freedom of navigation, and ultimately all of this is necessary to defend their own interests and not just to spite Trump or to weaken his power. All of that may very well be true, but for the time being, this is what they have decided to do. And for the time being, the US cannot single-handedly keep Strait of Hormuz open 100%. Some are arguing that Trump's solution, which will avoid having to engage with NATO over this, will be to simply grab Iranian oil tankers and sell them off for profit to compensate the countries. That may very well also happen, but I don't know whether it will resolve the entire problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Irina. And let's look at this, in the backdrop of this Japan-Singapore defense agreement. So all those things are changing, especially in Asia. Even, many other countries are having their own internal relationship with Iran or any other place, as long as with the US. Now the whole talk about aligning with one particular bloc, that seems to be, not taking off too much. People understand that situations can be different, and more bilateral relations will work in the coming days.
Um, all of that is true, but we are seeing a very complicated scenario emerge. Essentially, we are seeing several fronts of the same war. Russia and Iran are helping each other in various ways. Iranian drones are being used in Ukraine. This is why Ukraine is now being best positioned to assist Middle Eastern countries, and that's why Ukraine is actually Ukrainian experts are already helping with the counter drone technologies. And we are seeing a rhetoric in Gulf countries like UAE, which were financially and politically close to Russia for the last 4 years, all of a sudden changed to praising Ukraine for their assistance, whereas Russia has done absolutely nothing to put an end to attacks on these countries with which it was doing very lucrative business up until this point, and actually still continuing to do business. So we're seeing a convergence of conflicts with, while Russia and Iran may have different geopolitical agendas, and in some ways they're competitors. At the same time, they have joined forces on some level. There is an integration of conflicts, integration of technologies, and simultaneously splits, and arguments between Europeans, and all of that is leaving Asian countries fairly isolated. Asian countries are the ones who are suffering absolutely the most from the energy crisis, because Asian countries like South Korea and Japan are the most dependent on foreign exports of fossil fuels. They've tried to diversify energy with very limited and mixed results so far, and all of it is going to take time. No matter how successful it may ultimately pan out to be, for the time being, it's just not enough. But the energy crisis is not the only problem they're facing. They're also facing the distinct possibility that China could use this time, when US is distracted with Iran and Ukraine, to attack Taiwan, but also to harass and attack its other neighbors over assorted territorial disputes, which China is treating as its sovereign territory. For that reason, we're seeing a very rapid change in posture and in defense commitments in Japan, which has been traditionally peace-loving, uninvolved in any sort of conflict, but all of a sudden exercising a much more muscular foreign and defense strategy, and investing in forward basing and assorted military measures, and a much tougher rhetoric and a much tougher political position, and financial commitments to defense budget as well. Singapore, too, while it has been a traditionally open and liberal space for all sorts of economic investments, including from China, it is seeing, from the example of UAE, that has not protected UAE from Iranian attacks, and similarly, Singapore may not be protected from Chinese aggression. And so, joining forces, developing joint strategies for these countries is just as important in the defense sphere as it is in terms of economic collaborations. So we are going to see a lot of these changes in the near future, and a lot of cooperation and coordination. Japan and South Korea too are also joining forces.
War. So, in terms of you see new changes happening. One of the big things is, especially in the business aspect, whatever the oil thing happens, a lot of demand has increased for batteries, and in terms of that, China is the biggest, manufacturer of those batteries. How do you see this part of the world will start thinking beyond just oil, more towards other sources of power, especially battery, in terms of solar power and much more.
Well, there's already been a trend of some European leaders trying to strengthen contacts with China due to alienation from Trump, and due to the fact that there are some significant economic and defense shortcomings in NATO and European Union countries. But I think the current trajectory has only intensified this polarization and this perception that China is the player to go to for stability and for as a guarantor of certain things. And I think China will take advantage of that. One example of that is the British foreign minister making yet another clandestine trip to China. The Chinese sort of were more public about it, and he's been more secretive, and some of the British publications have been calling him out for that. But the bottom line of his trip is that he was calling for strengthening strategic cooperation with China. And I do believe that the current situation, which has revealed UK to be extremely militarily vulnerable and unprepared, is probably part of the reason. The battery issue, among other things, came to the surface because of the discussion about North Sea drilling and whether that should be an answer to the energy crisis and whether UK has become too dependent on foreign exports in its chase for green energy. And there's been a criticism of Ed Miliband in particular on his policies. I think some of the analysts have agreed that even North Sea drilling would not come soon enough to solve all of the immediate problems, but that the energy policy should probably be overall reevaluated sooner rather than later. In the meantime, the quick fix would be to try to get to countries that can quickly and easily provide the supplies for what is needed. And China, of course, is one of the top suppliers. But the other countries will eventually diversify and catch up to China and start utilizing their own rare earth supplies more efficiently for export. That of course, remains to be seen. The race is certainly on, but for now, China has the first movers advantage.
Absolutely. And what about the impact on the AI boom? It looks like that is also getting impacted due to this war.
Indeed, there are many things. There are many reasons for that. First, Amazon facilities, Amazon servers, and other servers have been targeted by attacks and knocked out, literally damaged. So while they can relocate from UAE to other parts of the world, once damage is done, it affects all the existing servers around the world. And UAE and other Gulf states have been very significant investors in AI technologies, but not just technologies, but also data storage units and all sorts of other cooperation. So if they're taken out of the game financially, militarily, in terms of actual just infrastructure disruption, all of that causes a massive setback. But there are broader implications as well. The energy crisis, of course, is rediverting all the nuclear energy supplies towards basic needs and away from what is seen as superfluous and luxury services such as AI development and supplying AI energy. So if the crisis persists, there will simply be a limited supply that will force companies to redirect towards basic fueling needs and away from more optional issues. So there may be constraints in new developments, even if some of the older, established services may still continue, and there'll be sufficient energy at least for that. So all of these are legitimate concerns, and of course, the supply chain disruptions are yet another factor. If ships cannot travel freely, if countries are economically constrained, if there are attacks on shipments somewhere, or if there are circuitous paths they have to take to avoid being jammed up, all of that affects the ingredients needed for AI development. So we may see difficulties and complications, and the longer the crisis and the escalation continues, the more difficult it's going to get, unless countries can figure out other ways of cooperating and recouping their losses.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our last topic of the day, Irina, is about the mysterious drones over U.S. military bases, Hexet residence. Means first we heard about the balloons, and now it's the drones which are there. That is still a mystery. Will this also remain a mystery? What is this all about? And people will think they can't stop the drones. how will they, be able to solve the problems of the world?
Well, at least we know that these are drones and not alien UFOs, but we have not identified the origin of these projectiles. And interestingly enough, it's not the first time mysterious drones have appeared. During the Biden administration, UK has experienced the same phenomena, drones flying close to military bases. And the last I heard, nothing has ever been revealed about the origin or what happened and why they stopped. Whether those were surveillance drones, who was sending them, whether it was a combination of just freelance drone enthusiasts violating space and trying their luck, whether they were identified and arrested, who knows. But what we do know is that after Trump criticized the Biden administration quite correctly, in my opinion, concerning the mismanagement of the spy balloon issue, he never actually proceeded to investigate those original incidents. And now, after 2 weeks of these drone appearances, including close to Hexeth's home, and the fact is some of the administration officials have been living in secure military locations. After given all of these security concerns, the fact that nothing has been done about these balloons, no one knows who is handling them, what is their origin, how to prevent them from appearing. There's been no strikes announced against those drones, no takedowns. This reveals a very significant domestic vulnerability. We had that vulnerability previously regarding the spy balloons, and it was psychological and political, at least as much as it was a conundrum in terms of limiting the impact and not causing panic and taking them down safely. But now we have these drones, and they're gathering information about military bases, presumably, and they are also assessing US reactions. And if I were to venture a guess, whether it's Russia, China, or Iran, or some combination of all three, or simply private enthusiasts who decided to take opportunity of the heightened militarized environment to conduct their own operations, none of that reveals that US does not have a coordinated plan for such occurrences, and has not prioritized domestic security issue, which again should not come as a surprise. DHS has not issued any domestic reports since the Trump administration took office. Tulsi Gabbard, the office of the Director of National Intelligence, said that domestic issues are not their provenance, and overall, no one seems to want to have that responsibility. Maybe J.D. Vance, in addition to being a tariff czar, could also be a counter-drone investigator-in-chief, but someone should be assigned the task of specifically tracking and resolving these occurrences before they become a far bigger threat.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot happening in the world, and every 2 weeks we come to you and understand about what all this means for the world, and as well as for businesses, as well as for politics, and much more. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.